Hello students, welcome to today's video lesson. Today, we shall discuss The Address. Published in the year 1957, The Address is a poignant story about a Holocaust survivor who goes in search of her mother's belongings after surviving the war. Before we proceed with the text, let us have a quick look at the author of the story, Marga Minko. She was born as Sarah Menko on the 31st of March 1920 in Zineken to an Orthodox Jewish family. She came to be known as Marga Minko and is a Dutch journalist and writer. Following the German invasion of the Netherlands in May 1940, Minko's parents and siblings were all deported. She was the only survivor and had spent the World War II in hiding. In 1957, Minko published her first book, Het Bitter Kruid, or The Bitter Herb. Some of her other works include The Other Side, The House Next Door, Return, and An Empty House. Most of her writings are extremely dark as they use her war experiences with the Holocaust and its crisis and consequences as a backdrop. You have read about the Holocaust in details in your long reading text, Anne Frank's diary. It was the deliberate killing and extermination of 6 million Jews by the German Nazi regime during the rule of Adolf Hitler. Most European Jews were killed in concentration camps where their belongings were taken away and they were tortured, shot, or poisoned to death. Marga Minko's own family became victims of the Holocaust, and the central character of the story is autobiographical in nature. Like Minko, the daughter has lost her entire family to the war and has returned to find that the person who her mother had once entrusted to safekeep their family's valuables has been using and enjoying them as their own, with their history and legacy being completely wiped out. Let us now proceed with the story. The story begins in the middle of the plot or action. We see the narrator outside a house at 46 Marconi Street, questioning a woman about whether she recognizes her. The narrator introduces herself as the daughter of Mrs. S, but the woman at the door, Mrs. Dorling, denies any knowledge of her by staring back blindly. This denial of the author's identity is metaphorical of the denial in which people were living after the war, trying to shove the Holocaust under the carpet and pretending that everything was normal. The fact that she has come back for her mother's belongings is not acceptable to Mrs. Dorling, who had hoped that the family had perished so that she would be able to illegally keep enjoying their belongings. At first, the narrator thinks that she is at the wrong address, but then she notices Mrs. Dorling wearing a green knitted cardigan. It had once belonged to the narrator's mother, Mrs. S. This confirmed that the daughter is indeed at the right address. Mrs. Dorling questions whether the narrator has come back all alone. She then excuses herself and asks the narrator to come back some other time. It is clear that Mrs. Dorling has no intentions of welcoming her or giving her back the things. She in fact says, "I regret I cannot do anything for you," even before the narrator asks for their family's belongings back. The narrator then walks back to the station, all the while reminiscing about the incidents of her life before World War II. When the Nazi Party captured Holland in the first half of the World War II, the narrator returned home for a few days to find various things missing from her house. On questioning her mother, Mrs. S, she was informed that Mrs. Dorling, an old acquaintance, visited their home regularly and took away precious items with her, apparently for safekeeping during the war. Mrs. Dorling justified her action by saying that she wanted to save all the good things in case Mrs. S and her family had to escape from the Nazis and leave back everything they owned. Being a kind and honest person herself, Mrs. S did not doubt Mrs. Dorling's actions or motives. She felt obliged for Mrs. Dorling's efforts of taking away her things for safekeeping. After this quick flashback, the narrator returns to the present day as she reaches the station. On her way back to the station, the narrator deliberately pays little attention to the streets, houses, and other things around her. She walks past familiar places again, the first time after the Second World War has ended. She has lost everything in the war, including her family. So, she intentionally avoids looking at familiar sights and thinking of memories from happier days, as she does not want to upset herself. The narrator remembers the first time she had met Mrs. Dorling, dressed in a brown coat and a shapeless hat. It was the morning after the day her mother had told her about her. The narrator woke up late and saw Mrs. Dorling leave the house with a heavy suitcase. It was then that her mother had informed her about 46 Marconi Street, the address of Mrs. Dorling's house, and asked her to remember it. After liberation, or the end of the Second World War in 1945, the narrator was initially very reluctant to go back in search of her family's old belongings. She was afraid of coming face to face with things which reminded her of her happy days, of connections that no longer existed. However, with time, life started coming back to normal. Food was easily available, homes were soon built, and people lived unthreatened. It was then that the narrator wanted to go back and revive the memories of her happy past, and became curious as to the connection she might feel when she touched her old things. After the failure of her first visit, the narrator decides to visit again for the second time. This time, she is greeted by Mrs. Dorling's 15-year-old daughter, as Mrs. Dorling is not home. As the narrator enters Mrs. Dorling's house, she begins to notice all the precious things which Mrs. Dorling had taken away from her house. First, she notices her old-fashioned Hanukkah iron candle holder, which her mother hardly used. Next, she walks into the living room and is instantly horrified. She finds herself surrounded by all her old house items. All her mother's belongings, as well as the family's, surround the living room space. The room feels very familiar, yet strange. The things are all arranged tastelessly or untidily. The furniture and the bad smell of the house makes everything appear extremely ugly. The narrator notices all the household goods which once belonged to her family. The woolen tablecloth, the white teapot, and the cups in which the young girl serves her tea were things that had once been familiar to her. The box and the spoons inside it had once belonged to the narrator's family as well. The narrator remembers an incident from her past when her mother had once asked her to polish the silver, and she was surprised to know that she referred to the cutlery and that they were made of pure silver. She leaves Mrs. Dorling's house quickly, almost as if in a hurry to get away from old memories. The narrator no longer wanted to remember the address of the house, nor wanted to go back for the objects which she and her family once owned. The objects were all linked to precious memories. However, when seen in a different place, amidst strange surroundings and without the memory of the former life, the objects seem to lose their value. She realizes that once objects are removed from their place of origin and their history and their legacy is denied or wiped out, they automatically lose the meaning and sacredness they once held. Moreover, we see how the narrator finally moves on after facing an emotional turmoil. She comforts herself by reasoning that her present home, which was a small rented room with a narrow drawer table, would not be able to accommodate all her mother's old belongings. This story is a great example of what war does to people. Not only does it take multiple lives, but also leaves people homeless and helpless, such as the narrator. She is so disconnected from the normal, happy life she once led with her family that looking at her old belongings in a completely different setting gives her immense grief and trauma and disturbs her. She wants to escape the memories they bring, as well as the feeling of alienation she has when she looks at them. She feels disconnected from those objects as she's no longer the young girl who had enjoyed comforts in life. War also makes seemingly normal people greedy, selfish and brutal, as we see in the case of Mrs. Dorling. With that, we come to the end of today's video lesson. See you next in our recap file.